Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, we're going to do some Winter Roses background cards. I'm using the Winter Roses background press plate from Spellbinders as well as the coordinating layering stencil. I always love when plates and stamps and dies have layering stencils to make coloring in so easy, as well as the fact that it gives you so many opportunities to add sprays or paste if you want to. I'm not going to do any sprays or paste for this video, but I am going to be using some interference inks. You know they're my favorite. If you've seen any of my past videos, I do use them quite often because they're some of my favorites. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a foiled background. This plate is stunning as it is, and I thought it would look absolutely gorgeous foiled with the Aura Glimmer foil. So the Aura Glimmer foil is a gold foil, but it has a holographic shine to it that I think is going to be absolutely gorgeous in these roses, and I wasn't wrong. So I had my glimmer machine heated up. Once it was heated up, I put my foil on there, the hammer mill paper down, and then pressed the timer button. Once the timer was done, I put that stack through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. You need both the heat from the glimmer machine as well as the pressure from the die cutting machine for the hot foiling. And then while I had my machine out and hot, I went and did the solid hot foiling right away. I'm not going to use it in this video. I often like to use the solid piece for either mattes or to use for die cutting. Originally, I thought I might use it for a matte, but I ended up going with something else once I was ready to put this card together. So I'm going to use some new to me interference pads. I got a few more to complete my collection. So I'm going to use the Cherry Bomb and the Golden Sun. Now, to be honest, I thought these colors were going to be a lot more different than they were, or at least the dye properties of the colors. They are very close looking. However, the Cherry Bomb that I'm using right here has a purple interference. So when you tilt it into the light, you get a little bit of a purple shimmer for it. And the Golden Sun has a gold interference. So when you tilt that one into the light, it has a gold shine to it. The colors themselves, the dye properties, are fairly close. The Cherry Bomb has a little bit more of like a pinky red color, and the Golden Sun almost like has a little bit of an orangey red color, but it is in some of the cases fairly difficult to see the difference between the two. I'm doing just some very simple ink blending here, and I'm not doing my typical using the white black ink on this particular background. I am going to use it for one of my backgrounds, so if you haven't seen that before, you will see that. For this particular one, what I'm doing is I'm trying to get heavier ink around the edges and then lighter on the inside. So I am dipping my ink blending brush in the ink, kind of going in circles around the edges to kind of build that ink up around the edges, and then whatever is left on my ink blending brush, I'm using that to fill in the rest. So I am getting some darker shaded areas around the outside and then some lighter centers. You could do the opposite of this and do like a circle or oval or whatever in the center and concentrate your heavier ink in the center and then go lighter around the edges. I thought it was going to be a little bit easier and have a little bit better look to do what I did, which is having the heavier ink around the edges. And I really love the way this looked. Now, I didn't want to use all interference inks for my first background, especially since the outline is gold foil. It's already got some shimmer to it as well. So for the first layer of greenery, I'm just using some Bundled Sage Distress ink. It's just going to add that beautiful color, but it's not going to have any of that shimmer. For the third layer, which is another layer of greenery, I'm using some Peeled Paint Distress ink. So it's similar to the Bundled Sage, but just a tiny little bit darker and a little bit more of a yellow tone. So they go well together, but I wanted to have differences between the different greenery pieces. This layering stencil has 4 different layers to it, so we're on the 4th and final layer. And for this one, it has some areas that are kind of greenery, kind of not. I'm not sure if these are rose hips or, to me, they look like poppy pods. I did them in the Summer Garden interference pad. I didn't want them to be in the Golden Sun. I wanted them to look green. So the Summer Garden is green, but it has some blue interference properties to it. So when you tilt it into the light, you're going to see a little bit of a blue shimmer. The other part of this layering stencil is some berries, and I'm doing that with the Golden Sun. Now, after doing the Summer Garden, I did take a dry cloth and I cleaned off that stencil. I didn't want to be picking up any of that Summer Garden ink while I was doing my ink blending with the Golden Sun one. So here is our background. I absolutely love that beautiful shimmer alongside the foiling, as well as having the complement of just distress inks that don't have any shimmer to them. Now I wanted to add just another extra texture. So these berries here, I'm using some glossy accents and I'm going over top of them, and I'm going to let them completely dry before I continue on with my card. This is a step that I'm doing at this point because the way my day was going, I couldn't be working on this for the next half an hour to an hour. So I had some time to let it completely dry. If you wanted, you could put your card together completely and then do the glossy accents. That would work as well. For what I was doing that day, this is what worked for me. So I kept it on my Altenew sticky mat, and I just put that glossy accents on there and let it completely dry. Now, I didn't put any glossy accents on the berries that were right at the edge of my cardstock, simply because I knew I was going to be cutting it down for my card, and I didn't want to chance that any of those glossy accents were going to flow over the edge of my card and go onto my Altenew sticky mat. Probably could have gotten it off if it did, but I just didn't want to deal with that. And because I knew I was going to trim it down, I just kept it from the edge just a tiny little bit. For my mat, I cut a piece of white cardstock, 5 3/8 by 4 1/8. My image piece, my rose garden piece or winter rose piece, is cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And I'm going to glue that onto an A2 card, 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So they're going to have really thin mats around here, but I just didn't want to cut too much of that beautiful background. Now this background is called Winter Rose, but I think you could do it throughout the year. To me, there's nothing about this that means it only has to be winter, other than the fact that some of the greenery in the background is holly. However, I have holly bushes on my yard. They are green all the time. So there's no reason that they can't be on spring cards, on summer cards. Why not? So I absolutely love this. I did put a Merry Christmas sentiment on this because, first of all, it's a winter rose. Secondly, I already had this sentiment foiled with the same foil as I used for my background. So I thought, why not? For my second card, I'm going to use that background press plate with some black Memento ink. I wanted to do just some plain ink blending with this, and I wanted just plain black ink. You can use whichever ink you want. I chose this one simply because I plan to use Versamark ink for my next pressing, and I wanted an ink that was going to be really easy to clean off the plate, and I could make sure that I could see that it was completely clean and wasn't going to stain the plate. I don't necessarily mind if the plate gets stained. However, when it is stained, sometimes it's harder to see whether it is clean or not. So I cleaned it off right away so that I knew that when I went to go use it for the next card, it was ready to go. I took my piece of printed or pressed paper, put it on my Altenew sticky mat. I absolutely love this sticky mat, especially for doing stenciling and ink blending. It holds the paper as well as the stencil so well. So this is the technique that I usually do with these interference pads. I like to do some ink blending with black distress ink. I use the distress ink because it cleans off my stencil really, really easily. You could also use that black Memento ink that was used for the pressing. That one would work as well. But I really like something that comes off that stencil really easily. I'm doing some ink blending around the edges of the flowers. Now, just like I said with the last card, I'm doing it around the edges so that the darkness is around the edges. You could easily do the darkness or the shading in the center of the flower and have a light around the outside of the flower. I just really like the way this makes the edges of the stencil look. Now for a bit of a change, for this particular one, I'm doing Golden Sun for the roses just so that they're a little bit different from the first card. I'm using all the same colors throughout this for, or the main color scheme. I will add another interference pad for this particular one just to change up one of the layers. But to keep the cards fairly similar color scheme, I'm using the same colors of interference pads. So this is the Golden Sun. After doing that black ink blending, I use a soft dry cloth and I clean off all the black ink off of my back or off of my stencil so that I don't get that transferring when I'm using my interference pads. I don't want to contaminate them. And it's really easy to have a dry, clean cloth right to the side to be able to clean that off and have a clean stencil ready to go for my next or for my interference color. For my second layer, I'm doing, this one is a greenery one, so I'm going to do the same thing with the black distress ink. I'm putting this distress ink where I want my color to be the darkest or where the shading would be. Typically that's at the base of leaves. Once again, I am using that dry cloth to clean off any excess. And the reason I like to do this is because these interference pads show up one color on light or white cardstock and a completely different color on dark or black cardstock. And by using the black distress ink before using the interference pads, you can see both of those color tones in the same areas, and I think it's just magic. I have a whole playlist for interference videos, so if you want to see me using it in this way more, and I use it this way with stamps as well, those will be in that playlist. It's just I just am always wowed by how these pads look and how they have two very similar or very different looks to them. So for my third layer, once again, this is another greenery layer. I'm going to do the same thing as I did for the first two. First going in with the black distress ink, cleaning off my stencil, and then I'm going in with my next interference color. And this is where I brought in a different color. This one is Magic Garden. So this is another green, but it's a little different green tone than my first one. This particular one, the interference color is purple. So when you tilt this piece to the light, you get a tiny little bit of purple shimmer on those dark areas. And like I said, I wanted it to use it because it was the only other green for interference. But I also wanted to have two different green tones. I didn't want all of my greenery in the background to be exactly the same. So it's a little bit brighter of a green, but it goes well with the rest of the look. Now what I was doing there is there was a piece of the stencil that I don't think had come off completely during manufacturing, and I realized that it was interfering with one of those stenciled leaves. So I wanted to poke that out of the way and put some ink down before taking that stencil up. So this is my last layer here. I'm going to do the same thing with the black distress ink. I did go and grab a detailed ink blending brush for this because this is the layer with the berries and either those rose hips or the poppy pods. I'm just going to be calling them that from now on. So I wanted to have a little bit of a smaller brush to be able to have a little bit more control with where I'm putting that ink. So once again, I'm putting it at the base of leaves or the base of the poppy pods. Because this one has some berries and those berries are fairly tiny, I'm just putting them on the berries that are closest to the flowers or go behind them. Now I'm using some cherry balm. This one is the one that has the pinky red color plus the purple interference. And I absolutely love the look of this one. I can't get over this color. I think it's absolutely gorgeous. I don't know why I waited so long to get it. So here is my finished background, and you can see it's really quite a bit darker than my first background because of putting that black distress ink down ahead of time. Now I am going to do the glossy accents on this one as well. I'm doing it on all three of them actually. I just love the difference in texture that you get by having the glossy accents on the berries. And anytime I can get a little bit of extra texture on some backgrounds, I really like the look of it. So once I have that glossy accents down, I'm going to let that dry for a while. For this size of berry, I probably would let it dry for about a half an hour. If you wanted to be able to test it to make sure that your pieces are dry, what I would do is get a scrap piece of cardstock, put some blobs of glossy accents on there that are similar sizes to the ones that you put on your project. And then if you have to test and see if something is dry, you can test that scrap piece of paper, and you don't have to chance ruining your actual background or getting a fingerprint and some glossy accents for that. It does dry fairly quickly though, so you don't have to worry about waiting too long or having to wait overnight, especially for just small berry areas. So for this particular one, I'm doing the same size layering. This one I'm going to do a black mat too. So that black mat is cut to 5 3/8 by 4 1/8. My image piece is cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. And once again, I'm putting it on a white card base. For gluing everything together, I'm just using Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle. I can use it for really tiny die cuts, and I'll be using it for a really tiny sentiment die cut for the next one. But I can also use it for larger backgrounds. And I always love putting a large acrylic block on top of my pieces while they're drying. It just keeps everything flat, frees up my hands for the next piece. For this particular card, I'm using some autumn sentiments. This is an exclusive Better Press plate on the Spellbinders website. They come in 4 different themes. There is a spring one, a summer one, an autumn one, and a winter one. And then there's also a stamp set. So I will link to that as well as all the other supplies in my description and my supply list down below. For the third card, this one I wanted to change it up and do some watercoloring. So in order to do the watercoloring, what I'm going to do for this one is I'm going to stamp and emboss my image. You don't necessarily have to, you could just use a permanent ink, but by stamping and embossing it, it gives a little bit of a ridge around the areas, and it makes it a little bit easier to watercolor because I don't necessarily have to make sure an area is dry before I work on the next area. So I'm using some Versamark ink on my Better Press plate. I am doing the pressing on some watercolor cardstock. I did use an embossing powder tool before adding my ink, or before pressing my ink on there and adding the embossing powder. This way I can reduce as much as possible the powder sticking to other areas and get a nice clean pressing. For my embossing powder for this one, I used liquid platinum embossing powder just for a bit of a different look. It kind of has like a champagne-y color to it. It's not silver and it's not gold, but it just has a beautiful look to it that I thought would look gorgeous with this background. So I'm using my embossing tool to melt everything in place, and it goes from kind of a granular matte color to shiny and smooth. Look at that gorgeous background. And you could even leave it like that and just have it a very simple background. Now, if this image looks familiar to you at all, it's the same, or this background plate is part of the line of the Handmade Holidays card making kit. And some of the die cuts, the Winter Roses die cut pieces, are parts of this background, or images of this background. So this will also go really well with that package as well. If you happen to have that package, this would be a beautiful background to use with some of those Winter Rose die cuts, or from the floral, I can't even remember what it's called, the die cuts in that kit. So I am going to do my watercoloring with my Cloud9 interference pads. Now, these Cloud9 interference pads are a dye and pigment blend. They watercolor just like dye ink pads. So I'm smushing them on my glass mat here, and then I'm picking it up with my water brush and watercoloring my image. I like to make sure that my edges of my roses are darker. So that's where I start, and then as I'm adding a little bit of water to the ink and wetting the entire surface, I will be going towards the center. If I need some areas to be a little bit darker while that surface is still wet, I will dip my ink or my brush into that ink and add some more wet areas. I'm not doing really detailed watercoloring with these. These florals are fairly loose looking, so I'm not being very precise with my watercoloring. I'm just creating a nice quick background. But even with this background, where that ink is the darkest, when I tilt this in the light once it's dry, you're going to see some of that purpley shimmer to it. So I love the fact that you can very easily get a little bit of shimmer accents in your watercolor. Now, for these particular pads, I don't have the refill. So all I'm doing is smushing the pad on my work surface and then picking up the ink from there. If you don't have a glass work surface, you could also use a plate, some recycled packaging, an old sour cream lid or something like that. So there are ways to do this. You don't necessarily have to have a glass surface to be able to do this, but it's a great way to get an extra use out of your ink pads. If you have the reinkers, you could just shake up the reinker because you want to shake it because that mica does settle with the reinker. And then you could put a dot of that on your work surface or on a watercolor palette. Eventually, when I do have all the reinkers, what I do plan on doing is creating a palette, same as I do with my distress refills for watercoloring, because I do want to use them more for that. They're an easy way to do watercoloring, but get that nice shimmer to it. So it would be very easy to have a palette, put a drop or two of the reinker color, and then use that for watercoloring. But in the meantime, this works just as well. So next I'm going to use that Golden Sun, and I'm going to do that for the berries. And I'm also going to use this for the rose hips or poppy pods. Once again, don't know exactly what they are, but for this one, I'm going to turn them into rose hips in the fall, where they kind of go a little bit yellowy, orangey red color. So I'm going to color them that way. Once again, with this one, I will start where I want the color to be darkest and then add a little bit of water from my brush as I'm blending out. I also have a piece of paper towel to my right that every once in a while I will dab my brush on, take some of the excess color or take some of the excess moisture off of it. So it comes in handy to have that right there ready to go. Now, if you don't happen to have interference pads to do this watercoloring with, there's a couple ways that you can incorporate a little bit of shimmer in your watercolor. So you can watercolor with dye inks or distress pads, and then you can add a little bit of a layer with some Perfect Pearls. They are a mica that has a binding agent in them that's activated by water, so you can make your own shimmery watercolor with that. You could also, if you have some shimmer sprays, you can spray them on your glass mat or a non-porous surface and use that as a palette to pick up. So like the new Distress Spritzes would work beautifully. Just pick a color that you want that shimmer to be. And that would be a great way to add a little bit of shimmer. What I would do then is I would wait for the initial watercolor to dry, and then I would go over the area with that shimmer, with that Perfect Pearls watercolor or with the Distress Spritz watercolor, and then make sure to moisten the entire area so you don't get watermarks. For my greenery here, I'm using the Summer Garden interference pad. This is the one that is green but has blue interference properties. So anywhere you see that it's darker, once this is dry, when I tilt it to the light, it's going to have a little bit of a blue shimmer to it, which looks really, really beautiful. And it's not overpowering shimmer, so I'm not going to see a whole bunch of blue on those leaves, but it's just a really nice subtle shimmer. So this is just to remind you and show you that with these interference pads, you can easily do watercolor with them, and it creates just a nice, beautiful look. Because I'm working on light cardstock here, we're seeing more of the dye properties to it, but we will see a little bit of interference shimmer. If I were to be working on some black cardstock, you're going to see more of the pigment. The dye property is transparent, so the black cardstock will show through that, but you're probably going to see less shimmer than if you were just stenciling with the shimmer or stamping with the interference pad. You're going to see a lot less because we are mixing it with water while we're doing some watercoloring. Now, I wanted to have just a little bit of difference in all the greenery in the background, so I took my peeled paint distress pad, smushed that on the edge, and I'm using that one for some of the holly, just so that there's a little bit of a difference and we don't have all greenery with it that is exactly the same color with the exact same interference to it. Again, just a little bit of variety. But this is really, really easy to watercolor with. There's no difference in technique than if I'm using my Distress reinkers or really even the Distress watercolor pencils. The only difference with the watercolor pencils is there's a little bit of opacity to them, so they have a bit more of a chalky look. But the watercolor technique is very similar. So once again, I'm going to add glossy accents to those berries for just a little bit of extra texture. For this particular background, I wanted even more texture though. So the very tops of the rose hips or poppy pods, I'm going to just add some little bit of stickles. Not a whole lot, not to make the whole pod glittery. I'm just doing it to the top, and it's just to add a little bit of texture. Often I would do this to flowers, to the centers of flowers, but because all of these flowers are roses, I don't want to put it on the edges of all the rose petals and basically have blobs with lines of stickles. I think that would take away from the pattern. So by putting it on the poppy pods or rose hips, it was a way to incorporate that extra bit of texture without taking away from those roses. So off screen, I did a matte and used that cherry bomb ink around the edges. I also did a little bit of that cherry bomb ink in the center to cut a sentiment out of. For this one, I'm using the wonderful script sentiments. I absolutely love the script to this and the shadow. And the hello one is just a nice basic sentiment. So I glued that to a white shadow, and I'll be using that on the front of the card. And because I cut this piece out of a matte from behind, my rose piece is going to go in front of it. You're not going to be able to see through it. You're not going to even see that anything was cut out of it. I'm just getting extra use out of the cardstock that I'm using. Because this is just ink smushed on cardstock, I easily could have used a scrap, but because I already had this piece out, I was already waiting for the ink to dry around the edges. It was easy enough just to add a little bit of ink to the center, wait for that to dry before die cutting that out. So the last step here is to add that sentiment to the front of the card, put my acrylic block on it, and let that completely dry. So here is the finished watercolored background. And if you wanted, you could get a lot more detailed with that watercolor. Once again, I wanted to keep it very simple and very loose. Here is the background that has that black distress ink, and you can see those flowers are quite a bit darker. We see more of those interference properties with it, but it creates a fun, different look as well. And then our first foiled one, I absolutely love the foiled edge on there and think it has such a beautiful, elegant look. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the time you spend with me, and I hope you have a fantastic day.